Marcus Thompson stood at the edge of what used to be a fence line, watching his 8-year-old son Jake chase a butterfly through the tall grass. The morning sun cast long shadows across the overgrown pasture, and for the first time in months, Marcus felt something that might have been hope stirring in his chest. The abandoned farm stretched out before them like a promise waiting to be kept. 200 acres of neglected land in eastern Arizona, complete with a weathered farmhouse, a leaning barn, and memories of better times etched into every sun-bleached board. Marcus had bought it for a fraction of what it should have cost, partly because the previous owner was desperate to sell, and partly because most people saw only the work that needed doing. Marcus saw possibility. "Dad, look," Jake called out, pointing to a red-tailed hawk circling overhead. "Think he lives here too?" "Probably," Marcus replied, adjusting his worn baseball cap against the glare. "Looks like we'll have neighbors." Jake grinned, his gap-toothed smile reminding Marcus so much of Sarah that his chest tightened. It had been 2 years since the accident, 2 years since cancer had taken his wife and left him to raise their son alone. The life they'd built in Phoenix had become too heavy with memories. Every corner of their suburban house echoing with Sarah's laughter, her voice calling Jake in for dinner, her hands tending the small garden she'd loved so much. The farm was supposed to be their fresh start. Marcus had grown up on his grandfather's ranch in Montana, and though he'd spent the last 15 years working construction in the city, he still remembered the weight of hay bales, the satisfaction of mending fence, the way the land could heal a man if he let it. When the insurance money came through and his grief counselor suggested a change of scenery might help both him and Jake, the idea of returning to ranching had felt like coming home. "Can we explore the house now?" Jake asked, bouncing on his toes with excitement. Marcus nodded, though he wasn't sure what they'd find. The realtor had warned him that the previous owner, an elderly man named William Hartley, had left in a hurry after his wife passed. The house had been empty for 3 years, and Arizona weather was hard on abandoned buildings. They walked up the dirt path to the front porch, their footsteps stirring up small clouds of dust. The wooden steps creaked under their weight, but they felt solid enough. Marcus turned the key the realtor had given him, and the front door swung open with a groan that seemed to echo through the empty rooms. Inside, the house was better than he'd expected. The hardwood floors were dusty, but intact, and late morning light streamed through windows that just needed a good cleaning. The living room was spacious, with a stone fireplace that would be perfect for cold desert nights. The kitchen needed updating, but the bones were good, solid cabinets, a deep farmhouse sink, windows that looked out over what had once been a vegetable garden. Jake ran from room to room, his voice echoing as he called out discoveries. "Dad, there's a room with built-in bookshelves, and the bathroom has a really old bathtub, and there's a ladder that goes up to the attic." Marcus found himself smiling as he followed his son's excited voice. This was the most animated Jake had been since Sarah died. In Phoenix, the boy had grown quiet and withdrawn, spending hours in his room drawing pictures or staring out the window. The move had been as much for Jake as for Marcus, a chance for both of them to remember how to live again. They spent the morning exploring every corner of the house and the surrounding buildings. The barn was in rough shape, but the structure was sound. It would need a new roof and fresh paint, but Marcus could already envision horses in the stalls, hay stored in the loft. Behind the barn, they discovered an old chicken coop and what had once been a vegetable garden, now overgrown with weeds and volunteers from previous plantings. "Look, Dad," Jake said, crouching down near the garden. "There are still tomatoes growing." Marcus knelt beside his son, examining the wild tomato plants that had somehow survived 3 seasons of neglect. The fruit was small and imperfect, but it was red and ripe, a sign that life persisted even when no one was tending it. "Want to try one?" Marcus asked. Jake nodded, and Marcus picked a small tomato, wiping the dust off on his shirt before handing it to his son. Jake bit into it, and juice ran down his chin as he grinned. "It's good," he said. "Sweet." Marcus tried one himself, tasting sunshine and earth and possibility. It was better than good. It was hope made edible. They spent the rest of the morning making lists of what needed to be done. The house would need new paint, inside and out. The plumbing worked, but was old and would need attention eventually. The electrical system was functional, but outdated. The barn needed major repairs before they could house any animals. The fencing would have to be completely redone if they were going to run cattle. It was overwhelming when Marcus wrote it all down, but somehow it didn't feel impossible. He had the insurance money to cover the necessary repairs, and he had time. More importantly, he had Jake beside him, chattering about which room would be his, and whether they could get horses, and if they could plant a bigger garden than the one Mom had in Phoenix. As the sun climbed higher and the day grew hot, they retreated to the shade of the front porch, sharing a lunch of sandwiches and water from the cooler in Marcus's truck. Jake found a lizard sunning itself on the porch rail and was trying to convince it to climb onto his finger. "Careful," Marcus warned. "He might bite." "Mom always said animals can tell when you're being gentle," Jake replied, his voice matter-of-fact. "She said they know if you mean to hurt them or help them." It was the first time in weeks that Jake had mentioned Sarah without prompting, and Marcus felt a familiar mix of grief and gratitude. They'd been worried that Jake wasn't processing his mother's death in a healthy way, but maybe he was healing in his own time, in his own way. "Your mom was right about that," Marcus said. "She was good with animals. Remember how that stray cat used to come around our old house? It would only let her pet it." Jake nodded seriously. "Maybe we'll get cats here. Barn cats like Grandpa used to have." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the lizard and the hawk and the way the wind moved through the tall grass. Marcus found his mind wandering to all the work ahead, but for once it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like purpose. The afternoon brought a tour of the property's boundaries. They walked fence lines that were mostly collapsed, discovered an old water tank that would need repairs, and found the remnants of what had once been a small orchard. The apple trees were gnarled and overgrown, but they were alive, and Marcus could see green fruit beginning to form. "Everything here is just waiting," Jake observed as they stood among the apple trees. "Waiting for someone to take care of it again." Marcus looked at his son with surprise. 8 years old, and he understood something that had taken Marcus months to figure out. This land wasn't broken, it was just neglected. Like a garden left untended, it needed attention and care to reach its potential again. As the sun began to sink toward the western mountains, casting the entire property in golden light, Marcus made a decision that felt as natural as breathing. This was home. This was where he and Jake would build their new life together. They drove back to their motel in town as darkness fell, Jake chattering excitedly about everything they'd seen and all the plans they could make. Marcus listened, adding his own ideas about cattle and horses and maybe even some sheep. They could start small, learn as they went, build something meaningful together. That night, as Jake slept in the bed beside his, Marcus lay awake thinking about Sarah. He wondered what she would think of this place, this decision to leave everything familiar behind and try something completely different. He thought she would approve. She'd always been the brave one, the one willing to take risks and try new things. She'd been the one to suggest they leave Montana for Phoenix when Marcus got the construction job, and she'd supported every career change and crazy dream he'd had. Now it was up to him to be brave enough for both of them. The next morning brought a phone call from the realtor confirming that all the paperwork was in order. The farm was officially theirs. Marcus felt a surge of excitement mixed with terror. They were really doing this. They were trading their suburban safety net for 200 acres of possibility and responsibility. Jake insisted on going back to the farm immediately, even though they wouldn't actually move in for another week. Marcus agreed, understanding his son's eagerness to claim their new territory. They spent the day measuring rooms and making more detailed plans. Jake picked out his bedroom, a small room on the second floor with windows facing east toward the mountains. Marcus chose the master bedroom, which had windows looking out over the pasture where he hoped to run cattle someday. They ate lunch on the front porch again, and Jake asked the question Marcus had been expecting. "Do you think Mom would like it here?" Marcus considered his answer carefully. "I think your mom would love that we're trying something new together. She always said life was about adventures, remember? I think she'd be proud of us for being brave enough to start over." Jake nodded solemnly. "I think she would have liked the garden. And the tomatoes." "Definitely the tomatoes," Marcus agreed. She always said homegrown tomatoes were the best thing about summer. They spent the afternoon in the barn, assessing what could be salvaged and what would need to be replaced. Marcus found himself thinking about the animals they might raise. Cattle certainly, but maybe horses too. Jake had been asking for a horse since he was old enough to talk, and out here there would be room for one, or several. As they worked, Jake found an old rope hanging from the barn's loft. With Marcus's help, he tied it into a swing, and soon he was soaring back and forth through the dusty air, laughing with pure joy. The sound echoed off the barn walls, and Marcus realized it was the first time he'd heard his son really laugh since before Sarah got sick. The discovery of the rope swing seemed to unlock something in Jake. He began talking about school. There was an elementary school in town, and he'd start third grade in the fall. He talked about making friends with other ranch kids, about learning to ride horses, about helping Marcus with the cattle. For the first time in 2 years, Jake was talking about the future with excitement instead of fear. That evening, as they drove back to town, Marcus felt the last of his doubts disappearing. This was right. This was what they both needed. The farm would give them purpose, challenge them, teach them new things about themselves and each other. It would be hard work, but it would be meaningful work. Jake fell asleep in the truck, his face peaceful in the dashboard light. Marcus drove carefully through the desert darkness, already missing the farm and counting the days until they could move in permanently. Tomorrow they would start the process of selling their house in Phoenix and arranging for their belongings to be moved. There would be 1,000 details to handle, permits to obtain, contractors to hire, animals to buy. But tonight, Marcus allowed himself to simply dream about the life they were going to build together among the apple trees and the wild tomatoes and the red-tailed hawks circling overhead. He thought about Sarah, wishing she could see this place, wishing she could be part of this new adventure. But maybe in a way she was. Every time Jake smiled, every time he showed courage or kindness or wonder at the world around him, Sarah was there. She lived on in their son, in the values she'd instilled in him, in the love that continued to shape both their lives even in her absence. The farm would be their tribute to her memory, a place where life could flourish, where dreams could take root, where father and son could learn to be a family again amid the endless possibility of the Arizona sky. The moving truck arrived on a Tuesday morning in late August, its diesel engine echoing off the canyon walls as it rumbled up the dirt road to the farmhouse. Marcus stood on the front porch with Jake, watching their entire life in Phoenix being delivered to their new home in cardboard boxes and furniture wrapped in blankets. The contrast was stark. Their modern suburban furniture looked oddly out of place against the weathered wood floors and stone fireplace. Sarah's antique dresser, which had fit perfectly in their Phoenix bedroom, seemed dwarfed by the high ceilings and expansive rooms of the farmhouse. But Jake ran from room to room, directing the movers with the authority of a much older person, and his excitement was infectious. "That box goes in my room upstairs," he called out, pointing to a container labeled Jake's Books. "And be careful with the picture frames. Those are important." The important picture frames were mostly photos of Sarah. Sarah laughing at Jake's 3rd birthday party. Sarah and Marcus dancing at their wedding. Sarah holding newborn Jake in the hospital. Marcus had worried about bringing so many reminders of her to their new start, but Jake had insisted that Sarah needed to come with them to the farm. "She's still part of our family," Jake had said with 8-year-old logic that left no room for argument. "Just because she's not here doesn't mean she's not with us." So Sarah's pictures found new homes throughout the farmhouse. The wedding photo went on the mantle in the living room. Jake placed a picture of all 3 of them at last year's county fair on the kitchen windowsill where Sarah could watch over any cooking they attempted. The photo of Sarah in her garden went on Marcus's dresser, where he would see her face first thing every morning and last thing every night. The unpacking took 3 days, partly because everything seemed to need a different place than originally planned, and partly because they kept getting distracted by discoveries around the property. Jake found a family of rabbits living under the front porch. Marcus discovered that the old water pump in the barn still worked, though it would need new gaskets. They both found evidence of the previous owner's life everywhere. Initials carved into the barn door, a child's toy truck buried in the garden soil, a coffee can full of old horseshoe nails on a shelf in the tack room. "Mr. Hartley must have really loved this place," Jake observed, finding a hand-carved wooden horse in what would become his bedroom. Marcus nodded, wondering about the stories these objects held. The realtor had told him that William Hartley had owned the farm for over 40 years, raising cattle and horses with his wife Elena until her death 3 years ago. After that, the old man couldn't manage alone and had moved to assisted living in Tucson. The farm had sat empty ever since, waiting for someone new to bring it back to life. The first real challenge came on their 4th night in the house. Marcus woke to the sound of running water and found the kitchen sink overflowing, water cascading onto the floor and seeping into the ancient hardwood. The shut-off valve was stuck, and by the time he managed to stop the flood, there were 2 inches of standing water covering half the kitchen. Jake appeared at the top of the stairs in his pajamas, rubbing his eyes. "What happened, Dad?" "Just a little plumbing problem," Marcus said, trying to keep his voice calm while water squished under his bare feet. "Nothing we can't handle." It took most of the next day to clean up the mess and assess the damage. 3 floorboards would need to be replaced, and the cabinets under the sink had swollen from the moisture. Marcus found himself on his knees with a hairdryer, trying to prevent warping while Jake helped by holding towels and asking helpful questions like, "Why didn't the people who lived here before fix this?" Marcus made a mental note to call a plumber first thing Monday morning. He was handy with basic repairs, but the farmhouse was teaching him the limits of his skills. The electrical system dated from the 1960s. The plumbing was a mixture of different materials installed over several decades, and the heating system was an ancient oil furnace that would need professional attention before winter. But there were victories too. The apple trees in the orchard were heavy with fruit that was almost ripe. The wild tomatoes in the garden continued to produce, and Jake had discovered several other volunteer plants, including sunflowers that towered over his head and pumpkin vines that were spreading across what had once been a lawn. "It's like the land wants to grow things," Jake said, carefully examining a pumpkin that was already the size of a basketball, "even when nobody's taking care of it." Marcus hired contractors to start on the most urgent repairs: the barn roof, the worst of the electrical issues, and a thorough plumbing inspection. The costs were adding up faster than he'd expected, but he reminded himself that they were investing in their future. Every repair made the farm more functional, more valuable, more truly theirs. Jake started school the week after Labor Day, taking the bus into town each morning and returning full of stories about his new classmates and teachers. The transition was easier than Marcus had feared. Jake's teacher, Mrs. Patterson, was a kind woman in her 50s who had grown up on a ranch herself and understood the challenges of farm life. Several of Jake's classmates lived on ranches or farms, and they welcomed him into their group with the easy acceptance of children who understood what it meant to live close to the land. "Tommy invited me to see his horses next weekend," Jake announced one afternoon, bouncing in the kitchen chair as Marcus prepared dinner. "He says they have 3 horses and some cows and chickens. And Sarah, that's a girl, not like Mom, a different Sarah. She says her family raises sheep, and they're really soft but also really smelly." Marcus smiled, relieved to see Jake making friends so quickly. The boy had always been social, but the last 2 years had made him withdrawn and cautious around new people. The ranch community seemed to be drawing him out of his shell. "Maybe we should think about getting some animals of our own soon," Marcus said. "The barn's almost ready." Jake's eyes lit up. "Really? What kind? Horses? Cows? Can we get a pig? Tommy says pigs are really smart." "Let's start small," Marcus said. "Maybe a few chickens for eggs. Then we'll see." The idea of chickens had been growing on Marcus for weeks. The old chicken coop just needed some basic repairs to be functional again, and fresh eggs would be both economical and educational for Jake. Plus, chickens were relatively low maintenance compared to larger livestock. They spent Saturday morning at the feed store in town, talking to the owner about chicken breeds and coop requirements. Jake was fascinated by everything: the different types of feed, the heat lamps for chicks, the automatic watering systems. They came home with plans to fix up the coop and a promise to return the following weekend to pick out their first birds. Sunday brought their first real taste of ranch community life. The Hendersons, who owned the property to the north, stopped by to introduce themselves. Bill Henderson was a weathered man in his 60s who had been running cattle on family land for 40 years. His wife, Carol, was a cheerful woman who immediately took Jake under her wing, showing him how to identify different bird calls and promising to teach him to ride when they got horses. William Hartley was a good neighbor, Bill told Marcus as they stood looking out over the pasture. Kept his fences in good repair, always willing to help with roundups or brandings. We were sorry to see him go. "What kind of operation did he run?" Marcus asked. "Mostly cattle, maybe 60 head at peak. Some horses for working stock. Elena had chickens and a vegetable garden that was the envy of every woman in the county. She could grow anything." Bill gestured toward the overgrown garden. "Shame to see it go to weeds, but I suppose you'll have your hands full getting everything else back in shape." Carol overheard and joined the conversation. "I saved seeds from Elena's sunflowers before she died. If you're interested in planting a garden next spring, you're welcome to them. She had these magnificent Russian sunflowers that grew 12 feet tall. Marcus accepted gratefully, touched by the kindness of strangers who already felt like friends. This was something he had missed in Phoenix, the sense of community, of neighbors who looked out for each other not because they had to, but because they wanted to. The Hendersons stayed for lunch, and Carol regaled them with stories of the area's history. The land had been part of a Spanish land grant in the 1700s, later settled by ranchers and miners in the late 1800s. There were Apache settlements in the nearby mountains, and the whole area was rich with stories of conflicts and cooperation between the different groups who had called this land home. The Apaches still consider this sacred land, Carol explained. The mountains over there were important to them for ceremonies and gathering certain plants. Most folks around here have great respect for that history. Jake listened with wide eyes, fascinated by the idea that their farm was part of something much larger and older than he had imagined. After the Hendersons left, he pestered Marcus with questions about Apache customs and whether they might ever meet any of the native people who lived in the area. Maybe, Marcus said. The important thing is to always be respectful. This was their land long before any of us got here. That evening, as Marcus tucked Jake into bed, the boy asked the question that had been on Marcus's mind too. Do you think we made the right choice, Dad? Moving here, Marcus looked around Jake's room, at the books on the built-in shelves, the wooden horse from the previous owner on the dresser, the picture of Sarah watching over them from the nightstand. Through the window, he could see the outline of the mountains against the star-filled sky, and he could hear the gentle sound of wind through the apple trees. I think, he said carefully, that this is exactly where we're supposed to be. Jake smiled and closed his eyes. Mom would have liked the neighbors. Yes, Marcus agreed. She would have. The next week brought the chicken coop repairs, which turned into a father and son project that consumed most of their free time. They reinforced the walls, replaced the roof, installed new nesting boxes, and painted everything a cheerful red that Jake chose. The work was satisfying in a way that Marcus's construction jobs had never been. This wasn't building something for someone else. This was creating a home for their future flock, a tangible step toward the life they were building together. Jake proved to be a natural helper, holding board steady while Marcus hammered, carefully painting trim work, and asking thoughtful questions about why they were doing things certain ways. The boy was learning carpentry skills, but more than that, he was learning the satisfaction of building something useful with his own hands. In Phoenix, everything was already built, Jake observed as they stood back to admire their completed coop. Here, we get to make things ourselves. The following Saturday, they returned to the feed store to select their chickens. Jake had done research at the school library and had strong opinions about breeds. He wanted Rhode Island Reds for reliable egg production and good temperament, plus a few buff Orpingtons because he thought they were pretty and because the feed store owner said they were gentle and good with children. They came home with 6 pullets in a cardboard carrier, Jake cradling the box in his lap during the entire drive home. The birds were nervous at first, huddling together in their new coop, but by evening they were exploring their run and sampling the feed Jake had scattered for them. Look, Dad, Jake whispered, crouching beside the run. That one's already eating from my hand. Marcus watched his son's patient interaction with the young chickens and felt a surge of pride. Jake was developing the gentle confidence that marked good stockmen, the ability to move slowly and speak softly around animals, to earn trust rather than demand obedience. That night, Jake insisted on checking the chickens one more time before bed, shining a flashlight into the coop to make sure they had settled safely for the night. The birds were perched close together on the roost Marcus had built, and Jake pronounced himself satisfied with their welfare. Tomorrow I'm going to name them, he announced, and I'm going to teach them to come when I call. Marcus smiled, remembering his own childhood fascination with farm animals. There was something magical about being responsible for other living creatures, about earning their trust and providing for their needs. It was a responsibility that taught children important lessons about consistency, patience, and the interconnectedness of all life. The chickens settled into farm life with remarkable ease, and within days they were following Jake around the yard whenever he appeared with the feed bucket. He named them based on their personalities. Henrietta was the bold leader, Sunshine was the friendliest, Ginger was the most curious, and so on. Each bird became an individual to him, not just part of flock. Marcus found himself getting almost as much pleasure from watching Jake with the chickens as Jake got from caring for them. The boy was blooming under the responsibility, becoming more confident and purposeful. He created a chart to track egg production, wrote detailed observations about each bird's behavior in a notebook, and pestered Marcus with questions about chicken nutrition and healthcare. "Do you think they're happy?" Jake asked one evening as they scattered scratch grains in the run. Marcus watched the birds eagerly pecking at the treats, their feathers glossy in the late afternoon sun. "I think they're exactly where chickens are supposed to be," he said, "free to scratch and peck and be chickens." It was the same answer he might have given about their own situation. The farm was exactly where they were supposed to be, free to build something meaningful, to live close to the land, to be the family they were meant to become in this new place they were learning to call home. October arrived with cooler mornings and the kind of crystalline light that made every detail of the landscape stand out in sharp relief. The apple trees were heavy with fruit, and Marcus and Jake spent weekends picking bushels of crisp, sweet apples that they stored in the farmhouse cellar. The garden pumpkins had grown enormous, and Jake was already planning which one to carve for Halloween. It was while harvesting apples that Jake made the first discovery. He had climbed higher in the old ladder than Marcus was entirely comfortable with, reaching for a cluster of perfect red apples near the top of the tree, when his hand brushed against something that wasn't bark or fruit. He called down excitedly, "Dad, there's something carved in this tree." Marcus climbed up beside his son, balancing carefully on the weathered rungs, and examined what Jake had found. Cut deep into the bark, weathered but still clearly visible, were symbols that didn't look like anything Marcus had ever seen. They weren't initials or words in English or Spanish. They looked older, more deliberate, like they might mean something important. "What do you think it says?" Jake asked, tracing one of the symbols with his finger. "I don't know," Marcus admitted, "but they're definitely not random scratches. Someone carved these on purpose." That evening, Jake drew pictures of the symbols in his notebook, carefully copying each mark. He showed them to his teacher, Mrs. Patterson, the next day, and she suggested he might want to research Native American petroglyphs and pictographs at the library. The symbols didn't match anything in the books Jake could find, but they definitely seemed like they might be some form of communication. The discovery sparked Jake's interest in the history of their land. He began paying closer attention to details they had overlooked during their first busy months on the farm. He found what looked like the remains of a very old fire ring in a clearing beyond the orchard, stones arranged in a perfect circle with charcoal still visible in the center despite years of weather. Near the barn, he discovered a pile of stones that seemed too organized to be natural, too purposeful to be accidental. "It's like people were here before the farmhouse was built," Jake told Marcus one evening as they checked on the chickens. Like this place was important to them. Marcus had been thinking the same thing. The more time they spent on the land, the more he noticed signs of previous occupation. There were faint trails through the brush that seemed to follow natural contours of the land, leading to water sources and sheltered areas. Some of the older fence posts were clearly replacements for even older posts, suggesting that boundaries had been marked on this land for a very long time. Bill Henderson confirmed their suspicions when he stopped by the following week to help Marcus evaluate the pasture for cattle readiness. "Oh yes," he said when Marcus mentioned the symbols on the apple tree. "This whole area was Apache territory for generations." Elena Hartley used to say she found arrow points and pottery shards all over the property when they first moved here in the 1960s. "There's a natural spring about half a mile north of your house that was probably a regular camping spot. Are there still Apache people in the area?" Jake asked. "Sure," Bill replied. "The reservation is about an hour's drive east of here, but some folks still come back to these mountains for traditional gathering and ceremonies. It's their ancestral land, after all. They have every right to be here." That night, Jake peppered Marcus with questions about Apache history and culture. They looked up information on the internet, learning about the different Apache groups that had lived in Arizona, their traditional ways of life, their relationships with the land. Jake was particularly fascinated by the concept of sacred places, specific locations that held spiritual significance and were treated with special reverence. "Do you think our land might be one of those places?" he asked. "It might be," Marcus said. "The spring Bill mentioned could definitely be important. Water sources are always significant to desert peoples." The idea that they might be living on sacred land didn't bother Marcus. Quite the opposite. It made him feel more connected to the place, more responsible for caring for it properly. If Apache people had found this land meaningful enough to return to generation after generation, then he and Jake were honored to be its current stewards. Jake's interest in their property's history led to more systematic exploration. Every weekend, they would walk a different section of the farm, looking for signs of previous inhabitants. They found more stone circles, additional carved symbols on other trees, and what appeared to be the remains of very old shelters built into natural rock formations. Marcus began photographing their discoveries, partly for Jake's growing collection and partly because he felt they should document these findings. The symbols especially seemed important. They appeared in several locations around the property, always carved carefully into trees or rocks, always in places that commanded good views of the surrounding landscape. The most significant discovery came in late October, just as the weather was beginning to turn truly cool and the mountains were taking on the gold and red colors of desert autumn. Jake had convinced Marcus to explore a section of the property they had never visited, a rocky area near the eastern boundary where a seasonal creek cut through a small canyon. They were following what looked like an old trail when Jake spotted something that made him stop dead in his tracks. "Dad," he whispered. "Look!" Ahead of them, built into the side of the canyon wall, was a structure unlike anything they had seen before. It wasn't large, maybe 10 feet wide and 6 feet deep, but it was clearly artificial. Stone walls rose from a natural ledge, fitted together with skill that spoke of experienced builders. The roof had long since collapsed, but the walls remained sturdy, weathered smooth by decades of wind and rain. Marcus approached carefully, aware that they might be looking at something very old and very important. The construction technique wasn't like anything he'd seen in modern building, and it definitely predated the farmhouse by many decades. The stones were selected and placed with the kind of precision that came from deep knowledge of stonework. "Is it an Apache building?" Jake asked in a hushed voice. "I think it might be," Marcus replied. "Or at least built by native people." "This is amazing, Jake." They spent an hour examining the structure from every angle, taking photographs and making notes. The stonework was beautiful in its simplicity, perfectly adapted to the natural setting. The location provided shelter from wind and weather while offering clear views in all directions. Someone had chosen this spot with great care. Near the structure, they found more carved symbols, these ones protected from weather by an overhanging rock. They were clearer than the ones on the apple trees, and Jake spent considerable time copying them precisely into his notebook. These symbols were more complex, more detailed, suggesting they might convey more specific information. "We should tell someone about this," Marcus said as they prepared to head back to the farmhouse. "This might be archaeologically significant." Jake nodded seriously. "It feels important, like we're supposed to take care of it." That evening, Marcus called Bill Henderson to tell him about their discovery. Bill listened with interest and promised to put Marcus in touch with a contact at the state university who specialized in southwestern archaeology. "You're right to document this carefully," Bill said. "These kind of sites are rare and valuable." Elena always said she felt like a guardian of the land rather than an owner. "Sounds like you folks have the same attitude." Dr. Sarah Martinez from the University of Arizona's anthropology department drove out to the farm the following Saturday. She was a young woman with Apache ancestry who specialized in pre-contact Native American sites in southern Arizona. Her excitement at seeing their discovery was immediately apparent. "This is definitely Apache," she confirmed after examining the stonework carefully. "Probably late 18th or early 19th century, based on the construction techniques." This type of structure was used for seasonal camps during gathering expeditions. She spent hours photographing and measuring the site, explaining to Marcus and Jake how the location would have provided everything needed for a temporary settlement. Water from the seasonal creek, shelter from weather, elevated position for security, and access to plant and animal resources throughout the canyon. "The symbols are interesting too," she said, examining Jake's careful drawings. "Some of these look like they might indicate directions or mark significant locations. Others could be family or clan markers. I need to consult with tribal elders to give you more specific interpretations." Jake hung on her every word, asking questions about Apache customs, seasonal migration patterns, and traditional uses for the plants growing around their farm. Dr. Martinez was clearly delighted with his interest and encouraged him to continue learning about the native history of their area. "Many Apache families still maintain traditional knowledge about these places," she told them. "If you're interested in learning more, I could arrange for you to meet some tribal members who might be willing to share appropriate information." Marcus and Jake both expressed enthusiastic interest. The idea of learning directly from Apache people about the history and significance of their land felt like exactly the right thing to do. Before leaving, Dr. Martinez walked the entire property with them, identifying several other features that they had missed or misinterpreted. What Marcus had thought was a natural rock formation was actually a carefully constructed windbreak. A depression near the spring turned out to be the remains of a roasting pit. Even some of the older fruit trees had been planted in patterns that suggested Native American agricultural knowledge. This place has been loved and cared for by many different people, she observed as they stood looking out over the farm from the front porch. Each group has left their mark while respecting what came before. That evening, after Dr. Martinez had gone, Marcus and Jake sat on the front steps watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold. The discovery of the archaeological site had changed something fundamental about how they viewed their property. They weren't just new owners of an abandoned farm. They were the latest in a long line of people who had found meaning and sustenance on this particular piece of earth. Do you think the Apache people who built that place knew about the apple trees? Jake asked. I think they probably knew about everything on this land, Marcus replied. They would have known which plants were good to eat, where the best water was, which places were sheltered in storms. They probably understood this land better than we do, even now. Jake nodded thoughtfully. Maybe we can learn from them. If Dr. Martinez can arrange for us to meet some Apache people, maybe they could teach us things about our land that we don't know. It was a mature perspective from an 8-year-old, but then Jake had been growing in wisdom as well as height during their months on the farm. The responsibility of caring for the chickens, the daily contact with the natural world, the sense of being connected to something larger than himself. All of it was shaping him in positive ways. The next week brought the first real cold snap of the season, with overnight temperatures dropping into the 30s and a light frost coating the grass in the early morning. Marcus made sure the chickens had extra bedding in their coop and showed Jake how to check their water to make sure it wasn't freezing. The birds seemed unfazed by the cold, their feathers fluffed up for insulation as they scratched through the frost looking for interesting bits to eat. Jake's interest in their land's history continued to grow. He started a project for school about Native American uses of desert plants, spending hours researching traditional Apache foods and medicines. Mrs. Patterson was so impressed with his work that she invited him to present his findings to the entire school at their monthly assembly. Marcus watched his son stand confidently in front of 200 students and adults, explaining how Apache people had used mesquite pods for flour, prickly pear pads for food and medicine, and various desert plant for baskets and tools. Jake's presentation included photographs of the plants growing on their own farm and demonstrations of traditional techniques he had learned from his research. The pride Marcus felt watching Jake share his knowledge was almost overwhelming. This confident, articulate boy was so different from the withdrawn child who had barely spoken during their last months in Phoenix. The farm was healing them both, but Jake especially seemed to be blooming under the influence of wide, open spaces and meaningful work. After the presentation, several community members approached Marcus to compliment Jake's research and to share their own knowledge of local history. An elderly woman named Dorothy Williams told him that her grandmother had known Elena Hartley and had often spoken about the Apache families who still visited the area to gather traditional plants. Your boy's got the right idea, learning about the people who came before, she said. Too many folks these days want to pretend history started when their own families arrived. Marcus agreed wholeheartedly. The more they learned about the Apache connection to their land, the more he wanted to understand and honor that history. The archaeological site they had discovered was just one visible remnant of a much deeper and richer story that stretched back generations. That night, as Marcus tucked Jake into bed, the boy asked a question that had clearly been on his mind. Dad, when we meet the Apache people Dr. Martinez talked about, what should we ask them? Marcus thought carefully. I think we should ask them how we can be good caretakers of this land, how we could take care of it the way they would. Jake smiled sleepily. I think that's what Mom would want us to do too. Take good care of everything. Marcus looked at Sarah's photo on Jake's nightstand, at her gentle smile, watching over their son as he drifted toward sleep. He thought she would indeed approve of their growing understanding of the land's deeper history, of their desire to be worthy stewards of a place that had been sacred to others long before they arrived. Outside, the desert night was crisp and clear, full of stars that had witnessed countless generations of people making their homes in this landscape. Marcus felt connected to all of them, Apache families gathering at the spring, Mexican and Anglo ranchers building lives from the land, and now a widowed father and his son learning to heal and grow strong in the same place that had nurtured so many others. The land was teaching them, just as it had taught everyone who had lived here with open hearts and respectful hands. And they were ready to learn. November brought the first serious test of Marcus and Jake's commitment to their new life. A late-season storm rolled in from the Pacific, bringing 3 days of steady rain that turned the dirt roads to mud and tested every repair they had made to the farmhouse roof. Water found its way through a loose shingle above the kitchen, requiring an emergency patch job in driving rain while Jake held a flashlight from below. But the storm also brought something unexpected and wonderful: their first eggs from the chickens. Jake discovered them on the morning after the rain stopped, 6 perfect brown ovals nestled in the nesting boxes like gifts. His excitement was so pure and complete that Marcus found himself grinning as he watched his son carefully gather each egg, cradling them like precious treasures. "Dad, look," Jake called out. Henrietta laid the biggest one, and Sunshine's is almost perfectly round. They celebrated with fresh scrambled eggs for breakfast, Jake insisting that nothing had ever tasted so good. Marcus had to agree. There was something deeply satisfying about eating food produced on their own land by animals they had raised themselves. It felt like a small but significant victory in their journey towards self-sufficiency. The weeks that followed established a comfortable rhythm. Jake would feed the chickens before school each morning, chattering to them about his plans for the day while they followed him around the yard. After school, he would collect the eggs and spend time in the garden where the fall vegetables they had planted were finally producing. The Swiss chard grew in colorful rows, the winter squash vines sprawled across the ground, and the late tomatoes continued to ripen despite the cooling weather. Marcus used the shorter daylight hours to work on indoor projects, refinishing the hardwood floors, updating electrical outlets, and slowly modernizing the kitchen while preserving its farmhouse character. Jake proved to be an enthusiastic helper, learning to sand and paint with careful precision that spoke of genuine pride in their home. Dr. Martinez called in mid-November with news that made Jake literally jump up and down with excitement. She had spoken with elders from the Apache tribe about their archaeological site, and 2 women from the Tribal Cultural Preservation Committee wanted to visit the farm to see the location and share appropriate information about its significance. "They're very pleased that you've been so respectful of the site," Dr. Martinez explained. "Many landowners don't bother to learn about or protect these kinds of places." The women who are coming, Maria Santos and her daughter Elena, are both traditional knowledge keepers. This is a real honor. Marcus felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. He wanted to make a good impression, to show that he and Jake truly cared about being good stewards of the land. Jake immediately began researching Apache customs, wanting to make sure they were properly respectful to their visitors. The women were scheduled to arrive on a Saturday afternoon in late November. Marcus and Jake spent the morning making sure the farm looked its best, not because they thought appearances mattered to Apache elders, but because they wanted to show that the land was being cared for with love and attention. Jake fed the chickens extra treats and swept the porch twice. Marcus checked that the path to the archaeological site was clear of brush and that he had fresh batteries in his camera in case their visitors wanted photographs. They both changed into clean clothes and waited with the kind of nervous anticipation usually reserved for important job interviews or first dates. The truck that pulled up their dirt road at 2 o'clock was old but well-maintained, painted a faded blue, and driven by a woman who appeared to be in her 40s. She parked near the farmhouse and got out, followed by an older woman whose silver hair was braided down her back and whose face held the kind of quiet dignity that spoke of deep wisdom. Marcus and Jake approached respectfully, waiting for the women to make the first move. The younger woman stepped forward with a warm smile. "I'm Elena Santos," she said, extending her hand. "And this is my mother, Maria Santos. We're honored to meet you and to see this place again." Maria Santos shook hands with both Marcus and Jake, her eyes taking in everything: the restored farmhouse, the tidy chicken coop, the garden where vegetables still grew despite the season. When she spoke, her voice was soft but carried clear authority. "Dr. Martinez told us you found the old campsite and have been taking good care of it. She said your son is especially interested in learning about our history here. Jake stepped forward, his nervousness evident, but his sincerity clear. Yes, ma'am. I've been researching Apache culture and trying to understand what this place meant to your people. I want to make sure we're taking care of it right. Maria Santos smiled, and the expression transformed her face, revealing warmth and humor alongside the wisdom. That's a good attitude for a young man to have. This place has always been special to my people. My grandmother used to gather plants here when she was a girl, before the white settlers came. Her grandmother did the same, and her grandmother before that. Elena added, "We'd like to see the site you discovered, if you wouldn't mind showing us." Marcus and Jake led the way along the familiar path to the canyon, both men hanging back slightly to let the women set the pace. As they walked, Maria Santos pointed out various plants, explaining their traditional uses. "That's desert sage," she said, indicating a silvery bush Jake had always thought was just attractive landscaping. "Good for cleansing and healing. And those prickly pear cactus pads, we still harvest them in spring for food. They're good for diabetes, good for the kidneys." Jake listened intently, occasionally asking questions that showed he had done his homework. He asked about traditional gathering seasons, about how plants were prepared, about the ceremonies that honored the relationship between people and land. Maria Santos seemed pleased with his genuine interest and answered each question thoughtfully. When they reached the archaeological site, both women fell silent for a long moment. Maria Santos walked slowly around the stone structure, her hands occasionally touching the weathered walls with obvious reverence. Elena translated quietly for Marcus and Jake. "She says the stones remember the hands that placed them. She can feel the presence of the people who lived here temporarily while gathering food and medicine." Maria Santos spoke in Apache for several minutes, her words flowing like water over stones. Elena continued translating. "This was a place where families came during the harvest of manzanita berries and acorns. The women would process the nuts while the men hunted. Children would play in the creek and learn traditional stories from their grandmothers. It was a happy place, a place of abundance and family togetherness." She paused at the symbols carved into the protected rock face, tracing them gently with one finger while speaking again in Apache. "These marks tell which families used this site and when they were here last. This symbol indicates the Coyote clan. This one marks a good year for gathering. This one says children born here, twins, according to the mark." Jake's eyes were wide with fascination. "So, it's like a historical record?" "Exactly," Elena confirmed. "Our people have always kept records, just not always in ways that outsiders recognize as writing." Maria Santos spoke directly to Jake in English, her voice gentle but serious. "You're living on land that holds many stories. Apache stories, Mexican stories, Anglo stories. All the people who have loved this place. You understand this?" Jake nodded solemnly. "Yes, ma'am. I want to learn all the stories. I want to take care of the land the way all those people would want." The old woman smiled again. "That's good. The land needs young people who care about more than just what they can take from it." They spent another hour at the site while Maria Santos shared stories about traditional gathering practices and seasonal migrations. She explained how Apache families would move through the landscape following ripening plants and changing weather, how they viewed themselves as part of the land's natural cycles rather than separate from them. As they walked back toward the farmhouse, Elena asked about Marcus and Jake's plans for the property. "We're thinking about cattle," Marcus explained. "Starting small, learning as we go. Jake wants horses eventually, and we're talking about expanding the garden." The old woman who lived here before, Elena Hartley, she was a good neighbor to our people, Maria Santos said. When tribal members came to gather traditional plants, she always welcomed them, never tried to keep them away. She understood that some relationships with the land go back longer than legal ownership. Marcus felt a surge of hope. "We'd like to continue that tradition, if members of your tribe would like to come here for traditional gathering." The two women exchanged a look that seemed to communicate volumes. "We would need to discuss this with the tribal council," Elena said carefully. "But if you're serious about that invitation, it would mean a lot to many of our people." Back at the farmhouse, Maria Santos asked to see Jake's notebook where he had been recording his discoveries and research. She looked through his careful drawings of symbols and his notes about Apache plant uses, occasionally commenting in Apache to her daughter. "She's impressed with your attention to detail," Elena translated. She says you have the eyes of someone who really sees the land, not just looks at it. Before leaving, both women blessed the house and property with a simple ceremony, speaking words in Apache while sprinkling corn pollen in the 4 cardinal directions. They explained that this was to ensure harmony between the land and its new inhabitants, to acknowledge the continuity of care that connected past, present, and future. The land recognizes good intentions, Maria Santos told them, but it also tests them. You will face challenges here. How you handle them will show whether you truly understand what it means to be guardians of this place. As their truck disappeared down the dirt road, Marcus and Jake stood together on the front porch, both quiet with the weight of what they had experienced. The visit had been far more meaningful than either had expected, not just an educational exchange, but a kind of spiritual passing of responsibility. "Dad," Jake said finally, "I think we just promised something really important." Marcus nodded. "Yes, we did. And we're going to keep that promise." That evening, Jake spent hours adding to his notebook, recording everything he could remember from the conversation with Maria Santos and Elena. He drew new symbols, wrote down plant names and uses, and began what would become a lifelong study of the interconnections between people and land. Marcus called Dr. Martinez to thank her for arranging the visit and to ask about the proper protocols for inviting tribal members to gather on private land. She was delighted to hear that the meeting had gone so well and promised to help facilitate any future arrangements. The next few days brought a subtle but noticeable change in how Marcus and Jake moved through their daily routines. They were more aware of the plants around them, more conscious of their impact on the land, more purposeful in their caretaking. Jake began identifying and protecting the native plants Maria Santos had pointed out, and Marcus found himself making decisions based not just on immediate needs, but on long-term stewardship. The chickens continued laying regularly, providing more eggs than Marcus and Jake could eat. They began taking the extras to neighbors and friends in town, including Mrs. Patterson and several of Jake's classmates' families. The simple act of sharing the abundance of their land created connections that felt meaningful and lasting. In early December, Dr. Martinez called with news that would change everything. Elena Santos had contacted her with a proposal from the tribal council. If Marcus was serious about allowing traditional gathering on his property, they would like to arrange a formal agreement that would provide legal protection for both the land and the tribal members who would visit it. "It's not something they propose lightly," Dr. Martinez explained. "This would make your farm officially recognized as a traditional gathering site, which comes with certain responsibilities, but also with protections. It would ensure that the archaeological site and the natural resources are preserved according to both legal and traditional requirements." Marcus didn't hesitate. "We're interested. Whatever we need to do to make this happen, we'll do it." The paperwork would take months to complete, involving lawyers and bureaucrats and multiple levels of government approval. But the intent was clear. The farm would become a place where Apache traditions could continue alongside modern ranching, where ancient relationships with the land could coexist with contemporary agriculture. Jake was beside himself with excitement when Marcus explained the proposal to him. The idea that their farm might become an official bridge between past and present, a place where traditional knowledge could be shared and preserved, felt like the most important thing they could possibly do with their land. That night, as Marcus tucked his son into bed, Jake asked the question that had been on both their minds. "Do you think Mom will be proud of what we're doing?" Marcus looked at Sarah's photo on the nightstand, at her gentle smile, watching over their decisions. "I think she would love that we're learning to be part of something bigger than ourselves. She always said the best way to honor the past was to take care of the future." Jake smiled sleepily. The Apache women felt like family, didn't they? "Yes," Marcus agreed. They did. Outside, the desert night was crisp and still, full of stars that had witnessed the signing of treaties and the building of fences and the quiet moments when understanding passed between people who cared about the same piece of earth. Marcus felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. Not burdensome, but meaningful, like the weight of a sleeping child or the trust of a good friend. They had come to Arizona looking for a fresh start, and they had found something far more precious, a chance to be part of the land's continuing story, to be worthy links in a chain of care that stretched back generations and forward into a future they were helping to shape. Spring arrived early that year, with wildflowers blooming across the desert in February, and the first warm days drawing Marcus and Jake outside for longer hours of farm work. The chickens had survived their first winter with flying colors, and their egg production was so reliable that Jake had started a small business selling fresh eggs to families in town. The money went into a coffee can that he kept on his dresser, savings toward the horse he dreamed of buying. The legal paperwork for the traditional gathering agreement had been slowly working its way through various bureaucratic channels all winter, but Elena Santos had called in January to say that the tribal council was optimistic about approval. More importantly, she had asked if Marcus would be open to hosting a small gathering of Apache families in March, when a prickly pear cactus would be ready for harvesting. It would be informal, she had explained. Just a few families who want to teach their children the traditional ways. We wouldn't need the official paperwork to be complete, just your permission as the landowner. Marcus had agreed immediately, and Jake had spent weeks preparing for the visit. He researched traditional Apache foods and customs, practiced pronouncing Apache words he found in library books, and even convinced Marcus to help him build a simple outdoor shelter that could provide shade for their guests. The gathering was scheduled for the second weekend in March, and as the date approached, Marcus found himself as nervous as Jake was excited. They wanted everything to be perfect, not just respectful, but welcoming in a way that honored the significance of what was happening. On the Friday afternoon before the gathering, Dr. Martinez arrived at the farm with a pickup truck full of supplies and 3 graduate students who would be documenting the traditional plant harvesting for their research. She had become almost like family over the winter months, visiting regularly to check on the archaeological site and to share Jake's growing collection of historical discoveries. The families are really looking forward to tomorrow, she told Marcus as they unloaded camping gear and research equipment. Word has gotten around on the reservation about what you're doing here, and there's a lot of respect for your approach. That evening, as the sun set over the mountains, Marcus and Jake sat on their front porch watching the road for signs of arriving visitors. The first truck appeared just as the sky was turning purple, followed by 2 more vehicles, all driving slowly up their dirt road as if approaching something sacred. Maria Santos emerged from the lead truck, followed by Elena and several people Marcus didn't recognize, adults of various ages and children ranging from toddlers to teenagers. As more families arrived, the quiet evening filled with the sounds of Apache conversation and the excited voices of children seeing the farm for the first time. Jake approached the group shyly, but Maria Santos spotted him immediately and called him over with obvious pleasure. "This is the young man I told you about," she announced to the assembled families. "The one who's been learning our history and taking care of the old places." The introductions took some time, with each family sharing their connection to the land and their reasons for wanting to participate in the gathering. Marcus was moved by their stories, grandparents who remembered coming to this area as children, parents who wanted their own children to learn traditional ways, teenagers who were researching Apache culture for school projects. As darkness fell, the families set up camp in the clearing beyond the orchard, their tents and sleeping bags arranged in a rough circle around a central fire pit. Marcus and Jake had offered the use of their house, but Elena explained that sleeping under the stars was part of the traditional experience. "Our ancestors moved with the seasons," she said. "They knew how to be comfortable outdoors, how to read weather signs, and find shelter when needed. These skills are part of what we want to teach the young ones." The evening meal was a combination of traditional and modern foods. Some families had brought fry bread and venison. Others contributed hamburgers and hot dog for the children who preferred familiar flavors. Jake proudly contributed fresh eggs from their chickens and vegetables from their winter garden. As they ate around the fire, the older adults began sharing stories, some in Apache, others in English for the benefit of Marcus and Jake and the graduate students. The stories were about this specific place, about the seasonal cycles that had brought Apache families here for generations, about the plants and animals that had sustained people through good times and bad. One elder, a man named Thomas who must have been in his 80s, told a story about his great-grandmother gathering acorns in the canyon where Marcus and Jake had found the archaeological site. She had been caught there during an early snowstorm and had taken shelter in the stone structure, using traditional knowledge to survive 3 days until the weather cleared. "She always said this place protected her," Thomas said, his voice carrying clearly in the still night air. "She felt the presence of all the women who had gathered food here before her, all the mothers who had fed their families with what the land provided. Jake listened with wide eyes, obviously understanding that he was hearing history that couldn't be found in any book. When Thomas finished his story, Jake raised his hand tentatively. Sir, when we found that place, we felt like it was important too. Like we were supposed to take care of it. Do you think that's what your great-grandmother would have wanted? Thomas smiled, his weathered face creasing with approval. I think she would be very happy to know that the place which protected her is being protected by others. The next morning brought the actual harvesting activities. Maria Santos and 2 other women led a group that included Jake and several Apache children to the areas where prickly pear cactus grew in abundance. They demonstrated traditional methods for harvesting the pads, using wooden tools that wouldn't damage the plants and taking only what was needed while leaving enough for the cactus to continue thriving. Jake proved to be a quick learner, carefully following the women's instructions about how to identify the best pads and how to remove the spines without injuring the plant or himself. The other children, both Apache and the few from town whose families had been invited to observe, worked alongside him with the kind of focused attention that came from understanding they were learning something truly important. Meanwhile, Marcus joined a group of men led by Thomas who were examining the land for signs of traditional medicines and materials. Thomas could identify dozens of desert plants by sight and knew their traditional uses, which ones were good for stomach ailments, which could be used to treat cuts, and bruises, which produced materials for baskets and tools. The desert looks empty to people who don't know how to see it, Thomas told the group as they examined a seemingly unremarkable shrub. But to people who understand, it's like a pharmacy and a grocery store and a hardware store all combined. Marcus found himself thinking about this perspective as they continued their walk. For months, he had been seeing the land primarily in terms of its potential for cattle and horses for growing crops and building a ranching operation. But the Apache elders were showing him layers of meaning and possibility that he had never considered. Dr. Martinez and her graduate students documented everything with cameras and careful notes, but they were clearly trying to be as unobtrusive as possible. This wasn't just a research opportunity for them. It was a chance to witness the transmission of cultural knowledge that had been happening on this land for centuries. The afternoon brought food preparation activities, with the harvested cactus pads being processed using both traditional and modern methods. The children learned to burn off the spines over an open fire, then help prepare the pads for cooking. The adults shared stories about how this food had sustained Apache families during difficult times, how the knowledge of desert resources had enabled survival in a harsh environment. Jake was fascinated by every aspect of the process, asking detailed questions about nutritional values, storage methods, and seasonal variations in availability. His notebook filled with new information, drawings, and observations that would become the foundation for future learning. As the day progressed, Marcus realized that something fundamental had shifted in his relationship with the land. He was beginning to understand what Maria Santos had meant about being a guardian rather than just an owner. The land wasn't something to be used. It was something to be partnered with, cared for, understood in all its complexity and abundance. The evening brought more stories and songs, with several of the Apache families sharing traditional music around the fire. Jake contributed his own growing knowledge, showing the carved symbols they had discovered and sharing what he had learned about their meanings. The older adults were impressed with his careful documentation and encouraged him to continue his studies. Knowledge belongs to everyone who will respect it and use it properly, Maria Santos told him. You have shown that you understand this responsibility. As the families prepared to leave on Sunday morning, there were many expressions of gratitude and promises to return for future gatherings. Several of the children had made connections that would clearly last beyond this single weekend, and plans were already being made for a summer gathering focused on different seasonal resources. Elena Santos pulled Marcus aside as her family was packing their truck. The tribal council met this week about the official agreement, she told him. They voted unanimously to approve it. The paperwork should be finalized within a month. Marcus felt a surge of pride and responsibility. We won't let you down. I know you won't, she replied. You and Jake have already shown what kind of people you are. This is just making it official. After the last truck had driven away, Marcus and Jake stood in the sudden quiet of their farm, both processing what they had experienced. The weekend had been transformative in ways that were still becoming clear. Dad, Jake said finally, I think I understand something now. What's that? When we moved here, I thought we were just starting over. But we weren't just starting over. We were joining something that was already here. Marcus nodded, struck by his son's insight. You're absolutely right. We're part of something much bigger and older than ourselves. The following weeks brought a flurry of activity as spring work demanded attention throughout the farm. Marcus began preparing pastures for the cattle he planned to buy, repairing fences, and installing water systems. Jake's garden expanded dramatically, with new beds for traditional Apache plants that Maria Santos had given them seeds to grow. The official signing of the traditional gathering agreement took place in April, with representatives from the Tribal Council, the State Archaeological Office, and the county government all present at the farmhouse. The ceremony was simple but meaningful, formally recognizing the farm as a protected site where traditional gathering could continue under appropriate oversight. Jake was asked to speak at the ceremony, representing the next generation who would inherit responsibility for the land. His words were simple but heartfelt. This land has taken care of many people for a very long time, he said, reading from notes he had prepared carefully. My dad, and I want to make sure it can keep taking care of people for a long time to come. We promise to learn from everyone who can teach us, and to pass on what we learn to the people who come after us. The audience, Apache elders, government officials, neighbors, and friends, listened with the kind of respect usually reserved for much older speakers. Marcus felt a surge of pride in his son, but more than that, he felt hope for the future of the land they were learning to call home. May brought the delivery of their first cattle, a small herd of 20 steers that would test Marcus's ranching skills and provide Jake with new responsibilities. The boy took to cattle work with the same enthusiasm he had shown for everything else about farm life, learning to read animal behavior and to move calmly among the herd. The Apache families returned for a summer gathering in June, this time focused on traditional hunting and tracking skills. Jake learned to read animal signs, to identify different types of scat and tracks, to understand how animals move through the landscape according to weather and season. Dr. Martinez brought news that the farm had been accepted into a state program for historical preservation, which would provide funding for maintaining the archaeological site and for educational programs about Native American history. Jake immediately volunteered to help with school tours and public education activities. As summer progressed into fall, the rhythm of farm life became as natural as breathing. Marcus and Jake worked together on daily chores, shared responsibilities for animals and crops, and continued learning from their Apache friends and neighbors. The coffee can on Jake's dresser had grown heavy with egg money, and plans for buying a horse were becoming more concrete. The first anniversary of their move to the farm arrived in late August, marked by a quiet celebration that consisted mainly of reflecting on how much their lives had changed. They sat on the front porch as the sun set, sharing memories of their first days on the farm and dreams for the future. Do you miss Phoenix? Marcus asked. Jake considered the question seriously. I miss some things. I miss the library where we used to go, and the ice cream place Mom liked. But I don't miss living there. What's the difference? Living there is just about us, Jake said. Living here is about us and the land and the animals and all the people who were here before and all the people who might come after. It's bigger. Marcus couldn't have expressed it better himself. Their life in Phoenix had been comfortable, but isolated, focused on their own small family and their own immediate needs. Life on the farm connected them to something vast and enduring, the land itself, its history, its future, the community of people who cared about it. As autumn arrived and they prepared for their second winter on the farm, Marcus found himself thinking often about Sarah and what she would think of the life they had built. He thought she would be amazed by Jake's growth and maturity, proud of the connections they had forged with their Apache friends, pleased with the sense of purpose that now guided their daily decisions. The archaeological site had been visited by dozens of people over the summer. Family groups gathering traditional foods, researchers documenting historical features, school children learning about Native American history. Each visit reminded Marcus of the responsibility he and Jake had accepted, the promise to be worthy guardians of something precious. In October, Jake's horse fund reached its goal. They found a gentle gelding named Copper at a ranch outside town, a 12-year-old quarter horse with the kind of steady temperament perfect for a young rider. Jake's first ride on his own horse was a moment Marcus captured in photographs that would join the collection of memories marking their transformation from suburban refugees to genuine ranch family. The year ended with news that the state university wanted to establish the farm as a permanent field study site, bringing students and researchers regularly to learn about traditional land use and archaeological preservation. Marcus agreed enthusiastically, understanding that the educational mission would honor the land's history while preparing future generations to be good stewards. On New Year's Eve, as they had the previous year, Marcus and Jake sat on their front porch watching the stars emerge over the Arizona mountains. But this year, they weren't looking toward an uncertain future. They were settling deeper into a life that had already proven its worth. "What do you want to happen next year?" Marcus asked his son. Jake, now 9 years old and tall for his age, considered the question with characteristic seriousness. "I want to learn to train copper to work cattle. I want to help with the summer gathering programs. And I want to start mapping all the traditional plants on our land so we can protect them better." Marcus smiled. The boy was thinking like a true rancher and a true guardian, already planning for responsibilities that would stretch into adulthood. "What about you, Dad?" Jake asked. Marcus looked out over the land that had become their home, their purpose, their connection to something larger than themselves. In the distance, he could see the lights of neighbors who had become friends, the silhouette of mountains that had sheltered generations of people who loved this place. "I want to keep learning," he said. "I want to be worthy of the trust that's been placed in us." Inside the farmhouse, Sarah's photographs watched over rooms that had become filled with the evidence of a meaningful life. Jake's notebooks documenting traditional knowledge, certificates recognizing their conservation efforts, pictures of Apache families gathered around their table, ribbons from Jake's 4-H projects. The land that had seemed like simply a place to make a fresh start had become the foundation for something neither Marcus nor Jake had imagined when they first drove up the dirt road 16 months ago. They had found not just a new home, but a new understanding of what it meant to be